Hey team, in this episode of How Bitcoin Works, we will be answering the very first question, what is Bitcoin? We will do this by taking a look at the official Bitcoin white paper, breaking down the terminology, as well as describing in words what the Bitcoin code achieves. The slide deck and references for this chapter are located in the description below. If you believe in quality and transparent open source education, and in the material that I'm presenting, please consider fact-checking my work and pointing out any bits that could or should be updated. This makes the education even better for the next person. If you feel that I have earned it, consider donating a like, sub, or share as well. That also helps me get the education out there for more folks who need it. So, what is Bitcoin? Well, Bitcoin's a lot of things, technically and philosophically. In this lesson, though, we are focusing on defining Bitcoin based on its fundamental engineering and operation. Some of the points that we're going to touch on are peer-to-peer, centralization versus decentralization, cryptography, blockchain, and proof of work. We're going to go through the entire Bitcoin white paper together and use it as an anchoring point for understanding what it is, what goals it aims to achieve, and what mechanisms it leverages to try to achieve those goals. So what is Bitcoin? To answer the question simply, Bitcoin is software. It is a computer program that was coded by someone, and it can be ran on a computer. The link to the Bitcoin software is provided here. You can visit that website, download Bitcoin or Bitcoin Core, and start running it today. Like any computer program, though, like Photoshop or Excel or PowerPoint, there is a learning curve. So I would just bookmark that page for now and wait until we arm you with a little more knowledge so that you're not overwhelmed. A more specific definition of Bitcoin is that it is a peer-to-peer electronic payment network that can be transacted on without a central authority or trusted third party. In the coming slides, I'm going to be reading directly from the Bitcoin white paper, which I will have on the slides themselves. And I'll be chopping it up into digestible chunks. A white paper, for those who don't know, is just a written report or proposal that explains a complex idea to the reader. It identifies problems, solutions, and the writer's philosophy on a specific subject. Satoshi Nakamoto put forth the Bitcoin white paper on October 31st, 2009, which is what we will be reading today. If the text is too small, I would encourage you to pull up your own copy real quick by typing the link below or on that slide into your browser. All right, so let's begin. We're going to start by reading through the white paper here. It's just 9 pages, so we should get through all of this relatively quickly. The yellow highlighted text is where I'm at in the reading so that you can follow along either on the slide or on your own copy. So we'll begin with the abstract. Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. Abstract. A purely peer-to-peer version of electronic cash would allow online payments to be sent directly from one party to another without going through a financial institution. Digital signatures provide part of the solution, but the main benefits are lost if a trusted third party is still required to prevent double spending. We propose a solution to the double spending problem using a peer-to-peer network. The network timestamps transactions by hashing them into an ongoing chain of hash-based proof of work, forming a record that cannot be changed without redoing the proof of work. The longest chain not only serves as proof of the sequence of events witnessed, but proof that it came from the largest pool of CPU power. As long as a majority of CPU power is controlled by nodes that are not cooperating to attack the network, they'll generate the longest chain and outpace attackers. The network itself requires minimal structure. Messages are broadcast on the best effort basis, and nodes can leave and rejoin the network at will, accepting the longest proof of work chain as proof of what happened while they were gone. All right, on to the introduction. Commerce on the internet has come to rely almost exclusively on financial institutions serving as trusted third parties to process electronic payments. While the system works well enough for most transactions, it still suffers from the inherent weaknesses of the trust-based model. Completely non-reversible transactions are not really possible, since financial institutions cannot avoid mediating disputes. The cost of mediation increases transaction cost, limiting the minimum practical transaction size and cutting off the possibility for small casual transactions. And there's a broader cost in the loss of ability to make non-reversible payments for non-reversible services. With the possibility of reversal, the need for trust spreads. Merchants must be wary of their customers, hassling them for more information than they would otherwise need. A certain percentage of fraud is accepted as unavoidable. These costs and payment uncertainties can be avoided in person by using physical currency. But no mechanism exists to make payments over a communication channel without a trusted third party. What is needed is an electronic payment system based on cryptographic proof instead of trust, allowing any two willing parties to transact directly with each other without the need for a trusted third party. Transactions that are computationally impractical to reverse would protect sellers from fraud, and routine escrow mechanisms could easily be implemented to protect buyers. In this paper, we propose a solution to the double spending problem using a peer-to-peer distributed timestamp server to generate computational proof of the chronological order of transactions. The system is secure as long as honest nodes collectively control more CPU power than any cooperating group of attacking nodes. All right, from the get-go, we get introduced to quite a few technical terms here, and I will go ahead and break some of those down for you. Firstly, nodes are mentioned here, and these are pretty straightforward. A node is a computer that is connected to the Bitcoin network running the Bitcoin software, and they host and synchronize a copy of the Bitcoin ledger, or the blockchain, with all other nodes on the network. In practice, all nodes on the network should have the same exact copy of the ledger at the same time. We also get introduced to the concept of peer-to-peer, or P2P. Peer-to-peer is when an action happens directly between two interested parties, without the need of any other party. So here's a thought experiment to illustrate this definition. Imagine you want to give your friend some homemade cookies. If your friend lives just down the street, you can bake your cookies, grab them, walk down to their house, and hand them the cookies. This is a peer-to-peer transaction. The only people or parties involved in this transaction are you and your friend. Now, if you live in Washington and your friend lives in Texas, you can still deliver the cookies peer-to-peer, but you'll have to make a journey via a car or maybe a plane. This might take a little longer. Still, the only people or parties involved are you and your friend. Or you can trust, keyword trust, a third party like DHL, USPS, or FedEx to ship your cookies to your friend. This is not peer-to-peer because you are relying on another party to temporarily take ownership of the cookies, and you are trusting that they will deliver them to your friend. Now, trusting a third party is obviously not automatically a bad thing. We do this all the time in our daily lives, and for the most part, things work out. But to talk about this example, packages do get lost in the mail. And even though there is insurance and other programs to mitigate the drawbacks of using the mailing service, there are still drawbacks. Insurance doesn't quite make up for the sentimental value of your grandfather's watch that went missing. And mitigating those drawbacks costs something. Ideally, we would want to leverage technology, just like we leverage a car to deliver cookies, to keep things as peer-to-peer as possible. A trusted third party becomes less and less attractive as technology gives individuals more options, power, and security to perform actions on their own. You can imagine that if you had the ability to teleport your grandfather's watch directly to your family member with a high degree of confidence, you would much rather do that than entrust it to another human being to be delivered. Lastly, before we start reading again, cryptography was brought up. Cryptography will continue to get brought up throughout the white paper because it is a critical and essential part to what enables Bitcoin to work in the first place. For that reason, I feel that it is important to at least define in simple terms what cryptography is. I will go into much greater technical detail on how cryptography really works in a later video, if you're interested. Cryptography is the practice of securing information so that the information is kept hidden from outside or unauthorized parties. This is achieved using a variety of tools and techniques such as ciphers, algorithms, computers, physics, electrical components, analog machines, etc. A cipher is a method of transforming text in order to conceal its contents or meaning. This concept of a cipher is probably not foreign to you. You can think of someone else speaking another language almost like a cipher. If you do not know Spanish and two fluent Spanish speakers are communicating, those sentences are obscured from you. However, Spanish is not a very secure cipher, as it is quite easy for someone to learn or translate it with a little effort. I remember when I was a kid, back before parents had phones so that they could text each other, they used to talk to one another in front of me using Pig Latin, which was the first cipher I was exposed to. It was a popular and fun trick back then, as it turned normal English into a real mess using a very simple set of rules. And to anyone that wasn't privy to the secret or the rules, especially a child, it was really hard to decipher. So example here is, my parents might want to say, hey, let's go out to dinner and, without the kids, let's leave the kids at home. So the key or the rules to the cipher is move the first letter of each word to the end of that word and add a pronounced A at the end. So your input is let's go out to dinner without the kids, and the output is etzle oge outye ote innerday ithotwe ethe idske. So yeah, that's a jumbled mess that a child probably wouldn't be able to at least immediately understand. Again, this was before parents could just text each other. Of course, you can take it a step further and create our own completely unique ciphers that maybe only you and I know about. Here's one that I made for this demonstration. The output is now not even really a speakable thing. I created this by jumbling the letters of the alphabet and adding a percentage at the end to account for a space. If I wanted to obscure the message from my kids, this would be far more secure than Pig Latin or Spanish, as it doesn't really look like anything and much harder to decipher. However, computers are much smarter than kids and adults, so this would get cracked within seconds. But this is the general idea. Bitcoin uses cryptography and hashes, otherwise known as just functions, specifically the SHA-256 and the elliptical curve digital signatures algorithm, to secure the information that is sent, received, and stored in the Bitcoin database, known as the blockchain. These methods are far more robust than the ciphers we just looked at. And again, look out for another video where I focus on cryptography in greater detail. All right, reading on. Transactions. We define an electronic coin as a chain of digital signatures. Each owner transfers the coin to the next by digitally signing a hash of the previous transaction and the public key of the next owner and adding these to the end of the coin. A payee can verify the signatures to verify the chain of ownership. The problem, of course, is the payee can't verify that one of the owners did not double spend the coin. A common solution is to introduce a trusted central authority, or mint, that checks every transaction for double spending. After each transaction, the coin must be returned to the mint to issue a new coin, and only coins issued directly from the mint are trusted not to be double spent. The problem with this solution is the fate of the entire money system depends on the company running the mint, with every transaction having to go through them, just like a bank. We need a way for the payee to know that the previous owners did not sign any earlier transactions. For our purposes, the earliest transaction is the one that counts, so we don't care about later attempts to double spend. The only way to confirm the absence of a transaction is to be aware of all transactions. In the mint-based model, the mint was aware of all transactions and decided which arrived first. To accomplish this without a trusted party, transactions must be publicly announced and we need a system for participants to agree on a single history of the order in which they were received. The payee needs proof that at the time of each transaction, the majority of nodes agreed it was the first received. The next idea that is introduced is the double spend problem. The double spend problem is when any digital currency is tendered or used as the input for more than one transaction. As an example, Susan might have $100 in her bank account. Susan purchases an item for exactly $100, bringing her balance to $0. The central authority in charge of the ledger to her bank account might be slow, though. Susan might exploit this by purchasing the same $100 item again right after that first purchase. The system might clear the transaction because her balance wasn't updated yet. This is a pretty crude example, but this problem still persists across all forms of digital money today. Fraud departments in banks and other financial institutions all around the world spend a significant amount of time and resources investigating and mitigating the exploitation of financial mechanisms just like this. Another real-world example would be check kiting. This was a pretty popular scheme back when I was working at a bank once upon a time. The criminal deposits a fraudulent check into one account and then quickly withdraws funds from that account before the check bounces. This process is repeated across multiple accounts, effectively creating a false balance that allows the person to access funds that do not even exist. This is an exploit of the long final settlement times that money has in the current financial system. It can take weeks for funds to be settled on the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve from when you deposited, withdrew, or spent them. These weak spots in technology are what create reactive measures like the 3 to 7 day check processing to prevent or mitigate this exploit. All right, reading on to section 3, timestamp server. The solution we propose begins with a timestamp server. A timestamp server works by taking a hash of a block of items to be timestamped and widely publishing the hash, such as in a newspaper or Usenet post. The timestamp proves that the data must have existed at the time, obviously, in order to get into the hash. Each timestamp includes the previous timestamp in its hash, forming a chain, with each additional timestamp reinforcing the ones before it. So this is where the term blockchain plays a role in this technology. The idea here is that the ledger keeps a timestamp of all transactions in a strict, trusted chain. The chain is the source of truth and trust between the majority of computers running the Bitcoin software, and that they agree that the ledger balances out and that no coins were spent more than once. Basically, all participants in the network verify against all of their own copies of the ledger that the transaction is valid and follows the rules. The stamp of approval is added to the chain. Now owner 2 not only trusts, but can verify that owner 1's coins are legitimate based on that timestamp. Moving on to section 4, proof of work. This is a pretty big section here, so I'm going to break it up into a couple of its paragraphs. To implement a distributed timestamp server on a peer-to-peer basis, we will need to use a proof of work system similar to Adam Back's Hashcash, rather than newspaper or Usenet posts. The proof of work involves scanning for a value that, when hashed, such as with SHA-256, the hash begins with a number of 0 bits. The average work required is exponential in the number of 0 bits required and can be verified by executing a single hash. So here we have just a brief outline for proof of work. I want to emphasize just how important this mechanism is from a technical point of view, because this is probably the aspect of Bitcoin that I see people get really wrong the most often. I will hear quite often from people either who just aren't aware or maybe are trying to deliberately spread misinformation, talk about how proof of work is just a number lottery where you solve a bunch of random equations and when you get lucky, you get a reward. Or, proof of work is designed to waste as much energy as possible. These claims are factually inaccurate, as we will prove here in the further technical deep dives. But this simple explanation straight from the white paper provides sufficient clarification as to why it was implemented in the first place. And we can juxtapose this thesis against other non-proof of work cryptocurrencies, and democratic systems to see what happens when you do not account for this issue in your engineering. So, for our timestamp network, we implement the proof of work by incrementing a nonce or the block until a value is found that gives the block's hash the required 0 bits. Once the CPU effort has been expended to make it satisfy the proof of work, the block cannot be changed without redoing the work. As later blocks are chained after it, the work to change the block would include redoing all of the blocks after it. Okay, so here we have the actual mechanism for proof of work. The mechanism is that the work is scanning for a value or number that, when plugged into a hashing function, produces a value that has a determined requirement of leading 0 bits. The more 0 bits that the software determines is needed, the more exponential the work or energy is required. The number of leading 0 bits asked for is not randomly or arbitrarily determined. It is the difficulty of proof of work, and we will see here shortly how that is determined. The proof of work also solves the problem of determining representation in majority decision making. If the majority were based on one IP address, one vote, it could be subverted by anyone able to allocate many IP addresses. Proof of work is essentially one CPU, one vote. The majority decision is represented by the longest chain, which has the greatest proof of work effort invested in it. If a majority of CPU power is controlled by honest nodes, the honest chain will grow the fastest and outpace any competing chains. To modify a passed block, an attacker would have to redo the proof of work of the block and all of the blocks after it, and then catch up with and surpass the work of the honest nodes. We will show later that the probability of a slower attacker catching up diminishes exponentially as subsequent blocks are added. To compensate for increasing hardware speed and varying interest in running nodes over time, the proof of work difficulty is determined by a moving average targeting an average number of blocks per hour. If they're generated too fast, the difficulty increases. All right, so right here we can see that the number of leading zeros, which exponentially determines how easy or hard validation is determined dynamically by the system based on block verification times. In other words, the software aims to validate a certain number of blocks per hour, and it will increase or decrease the difficulty so that that same number of blocks per hour is met, regardless if there's a huge increase in computing capabilities or a decrease. We also have a decentralized and democratic ledger of transactions that all participants of the network are essentially voting on. In other words, nodes are running the Bitcoin software version and validating blocks of transactions on the blockchain that they have verified to be truthful. If an attacker wanted to change this ledger and add some zeros to the balance of their wallet, because of encryption, they would not simply be able to just hack the transaction and add those zeros. As described here, they would have to completely redo all of the work of the previous blocks. You couldn't just spoof more IP addresses or steal a bunch of identities or computers, or steal a bunch of money or get a bunch of money and redo all of the verification. You would have to spend the energy which can't be spoofed, corrupted, or simply confiscated from somebody else, especially when the collective energy you are working against is the entire globe, everybody involved in the network, not just, your local power grid. To say this another way, if we remember the nodes are just computers connected to the Bitcoin network that contain a copy of the ledger, an attacker would have to spend enough energy to change the ledger on more than 51% of all of the nodes. That would mean catching up to and surpassing, all at the same exact time. Because of the encryption, which cannot be cracked, the attacker cannot just take control of 51% or more of the nodes simultaneously and copy and paste their own ledger. An attacker's only option is to control 51% or more of the processing power of the network to gain authorization to write their bogus ledger to all the nodes. Objectively, the more energy the Bitcoin network demands, the more secure it becomes. That being said, this particular part or aspect of Bitcoin can get very opinionated very quickly, especially today with the discussions and conversations around energy and resources and the environment and things like that. I would encourage you to take away from this just the fact that Satoshi Nakamoto thought that this proof of work mechanism would combat as many vectors of attack as possible on the system and prevent bad actors from corrupting the network. I will quickly insert my personal opinion here. This is just a personal opinion. And it's important that I remain transparent with that. I do personally think this is very good engineering, and it fixes the biggest exploit that democracy has, or voting. I personally really enjoy and champion democracy and voting, but I think it has problems caused by people, the human condition. Votes can be compromised, spoofed, bought, sold, and bartered. Whether that's voting with pen and paper or through an IP address or anything like that. And this, as much as I love humanity, this behavior is unavoidable, and it leads to corrupt organizations, systems, processes, governments, you name it, and networks. I think Nakamoto also felt this way and sought to find a way to have all participants of the network vote on the truthful ledger and on changes to the Bitcoin code in a way that can't be compromised, so that participants of this network could rely and depend on the integrity of the network forever. After 15 years and a $500 billion bug bounty on the head of this network, Bitcoin has never been hacked or compromised. So yeah, Bitcoin does cost energy to operate and does cost a lot of energy to operate. But I think it's worth it for the value that it provides. Moving on, section 5, network. The steps to run the network are as follows. 1. New transactions are broadcast to all nodes. 2. Each node collects new transactions into a block. 3. Each node works on finding a difficult proof of work for its block. 4. When a node finds a proof of work, it broadcasts the block to all nodes. 5. Nodes accept the block only if the transactions are valid and not already spent. 6. Nodes express their acceptance of the block by working on creating the next block in the chain, using the hash of the accepted block as the previous hash. Nodes always consider the longest chain to be the correct one and will keep working on extending it. If two nodes broadcast different versions of the next block simultaneously, some nodes may receive one or the other first. In that case, they work on the first one they received, but save the other branch in case it becomes longer. The tie will be broken when the next proof of work is found and one branch becomes longer. The nodes that were working on the other branch will then switch to the longer one. New transaction broadcasts do not necessarily need to reach all nodes. As long as they reach many nodes, they will get into the block before long. Block broadcasts are also tolerant of dropped messages. If a node does not receive a block, it will request it when it receives the next block and realizes that it missed one. So, what is essentially described here is the mechanism to achieve agreement between all nodes. Transactions and blocks are broadcast to all nodes, aka computers running the Bitcoin software. And through these mechanisms, we get a network where every computer, more or less, has the same exact ledger on it, and they all agree that it's correct, valid, and truthful. On to the next section, section 6, incentives. By convention, the first transaction in a block is a special transaction that starts a new coin owned by the creator of the block. This adds an incentive for nodes to support the network and provides a way to initially distribute coins into circulation, since there is no central authority to issue them. The steady addition of a constant amount of new coins is analogous to gold miners expending resources to add gold into circulation. In our case, it is CPU time and electricity that is expended. The incentive can also be funded with transaction fees. If the output value of a transaction is less than its input value, the difference is a transaction fee that is added to the incentive value of the block containing the transaction. Once a predetermined number of coins have entered circulation, the incentive can transition entirely to transaction fees and be completely inflation-free. The incentive may help encourage nodes to stay honest. If a greedy attacker is able to assemble more CPU power than all of the honest nodes, he would have to choose between using it to defraud people by stealing back his own payments, or using it to generate new coins. He ought to find it more profitable to play by the rules, such rules that favor him with more new coins than everyone else combined, than to undermine the system and the validity of his own wealth. So this section describes two really important parts here. One being the incentive structure of Bitcoin, and two, what will happen to Bitcoin once all the 21 million Bitcoins have been mined, which is a popular question that a lot of people have. To address the first part, the incentive structure of Bitcoin, as described here, is the issuance of coins to block creators. Blocks are the groups or batches of transactions that are verified through the proof of work mining. Once the block reaches capacity, it gets verified, attached to the blockchain, and the coin reward is distributed. Those coins, as well as the transaction fees, are the incentive for people to expend time and energy through proof of work to process and verify transactions with their computer. Because the incentive structure is dependent on the integrity of the network and the validity of the transactions, there is a higher incentive to participate in the network rather than to try to break it. If a hacker were able to break the rules, the value of the Bitcoin network would pretty much fall apart, and all of the Bitcoin that they were able to print out of thin air would become worthless and not worth the effort that they expended in the first place. A popular question that people ask is, what will happen when all the Bitcoin is mined? Well, it is spelled out right here in the white paper. The incentive shifts from receiving Bitcoin itself to receiving the transaction fees. This will happen seamlessly and elegantly with no interruptions to the network. However, the cost to transact on the network will likely increase by a large amount. It is difficult to say just how high these transaction fees will be and what effect they will have. However, it is likely that layers, like the Lightning Network, which you may have heard of, but if not, that's okay. Don't worry about it. We'll cover that in another video. But those layers, or the platforms being built on top of the Bitcoin base layer, will be invaluable to Bitcoin as a means to further batch transactions as a single transaction in an overnight job to reduce costs, much like how money instruments like checks are processed today. Section 7, reclaiming disk space. Once the latest transaction in a coin is buried under enough blocks, the spent transactions before it can be discarded to save disk space. To facilitate this without breaking the block's hash, transactions are hashed in a Merkle tree, with only the root included in the block's hash. Old blocks can then be compacted by stubbing off branches of the tree. The interior hashes do not need to be stored. A block header with no transactions would be about 80 bytes. If we suppose blocks are generated every 10 minutes, 80 bytes times 6 times 24 times 365 equals 4.2 megabytes per year. With computer systems typically selling the 2 gigabyte of RAM as of 2008, and Moore's Law predicting current growth of 1.2 gigabytes per year, storage should not be a problem even if the block headers must be kept in memory. Another really interesting section here. This describes how Bitcoin tries to save space. Bitcoin is software that runs on computer and stores the blockchain on that computer, the whole blockchain. Merkle trees are able to compress the data down in a way that keeps all of the necessary information available and valid, and then trims off the rest. You can see in the last section, Satoshi wanted to account for the development of disk space available to consumers to help keep Bitcoin in the hands of as many average people as possible, making it more decentralized and powerful. It is important to remember that mining and nodes are separated powers in this democratic system. So while mining has become really only feasible at an industrial level as of right now, 2023, and it'll probably remain that way going forward, validation and node operation is still done on a consumer level with consumer level hardware by ordinary participants of the network like you and me. And this was implemented to ensure that that would remain possible even as the blockchain got bigger and bigger. What a person can store on their consumer available hardware at the time that they are alive or present should not exceed what is available to them at a reasonable consumer level. Section 8, Simplified Payment Verification. It is possible to verify payments without running a full network node. A user only needs to keep a copy of the block headers of the longest proof of work chain, which he can get by querying network nodes until he's convinced he has the longest chain, and obtain the Merkle branch linking the transaction to the block it's timestamped in. He can't check the transaction for himself, but by linking it to a place in the chain, he can see that the network node has accepted it, and blocks added after it further confirm the network has accepted it. As such, the verification is reliable as long as honest nodes control the network, but is more vulnerable if the network is overpowered by an attacker. While network nodes can verify transactions for themselves, the simplified method can be fooled by an attacker's fabricated transactions for as long as the attacker can continue to overpower the network. One strategy to protect against this would be to accept alerts from network nodes when they detect an invalid block, prompting the user's software to download the full block and alerted transactions to confirm the inconsistency. Businesses that receive frequent payments will probably still want to run their own nodes for more independent security and quicker verification. So this section basically expands on the Merkle tree solution on saving disk space. You can still validate transactions with block headers. However, if an attacker takes over the network, it's even easier for them to process phony transactions through nodes that don't have the full blockchain. As such, to ensure the global health of the network and the validity of transactions that you personally make, it's a good idea to run your own full node. In other words, have a full copy of the blockchain on your node. In the coming chapters, we will go through the steps on how you can achieve that. Although it would be possible to handle coins individually, it would be unwieldy to make a separate transaction for every cent in a transfer. To allow value to be split and combined, transactions contain multiple inputs and outputs. Normally, there will be either a single input from a larger previous transaction or multiple inputs combining smaller amounts, and at most 2 outputs. One for the payment and one returning the change, if any, back to the sender. It should be noted that fan-out, where a transaction depends on several transactions, and those transactions depend on many more, is not a problem here. There is never the need to extract a complete standalone copy of a transaction's history. So this section doesn't make it super obvious what's being described, but what is being described here is how a desired sum is made up of smaller parts of change. And we call these UTXOs, or unspent transaction outputs. So for example, if you were to pay cash for an item that cost exactly $20, you may not always have exactly one $20 bill. You might use a $10 bill and 2 $5 bills. Each of those bills is an input for the transaction. The output can then be a single $20 bill or 2 $10 bills, or any combination of change. These bills are known as the UTXOs. Again, this is another concept that I will dive further into in a dedicated video. But suffice it to say for now that really what's just being described here is how change is handled, tendered, and given. Section 10, privacy. The traditional banking model achieves a level of privacy by limiting access to information to the parties involved and the trusted third party. The necessity to announce all transactions publicly precludes this method, but privacy can still be maintained by breaking the flow of information in another place, by keeping public keys anonymous. The public can see that someone is sending an amount to someone else, but without information linking the transaction to anyone. This is similar to the level of information released by stock exchanges, where the time and size of individual trades, the tape, is made public, but without telling who the parties were. As an additional firewall, a new key pair should be used for each transaction to keep them from being linked to a common owner. Some linking is still unavoidable with multi-input transactions, the UTXOs, which necessarily reveal that their inputs were owned by the same owner. The risk is that if the owner of a key is revealed, linking could reveal another transaction that belonged to the same owner. So this is another really important section that carries with it a history of misinformation or misinterpretations. Again, either intentionally or unintentionally, people will spread word that Bitcoin is anonymous, completely private, they can't track you, and subsequently that means it's ideal for criminals and creeps. It's important to understand first, though, that the role identity and privacy plays in all systems, including the payment systems everyone is already familiar with today. It is the intention and goal to keep as much information about a person's identity as private as possible when transacting on any payment rail, be it PayPal, Visa, wires, whatever. This prevents exploitation and attacks from bad actors who might use that information to do bad things. That being said, the goal from the beginning was the same as all other payment systems, to keep identity as safe as possible. The way that Satoshi Nakamoto implemented this was to remove the identity portion of the transaction altogether, as it states here in the paper. Despite that, as he states, should even just one transaction be linked to an identity, all other connected transactions could eventually be followed and tied to that same identity. This becomes exponentially harder to do as more transactions occur, just like how chasing a dollar down gets really difficult after it's been in circulation for a very long time, but it can be done with enough effort. Just as with your internet presence, your dollar bills, and your Bitcoin, your level of privacy and trackability is dependent on the effort that you expend. In the case of Bitcoin, the base case is privacy similar to cash, but it is not a magically anonymous system that prevents anybody from ever seeing what you do or tying an identity to you. It's just mimics the privacy that you have with cash, which is not completely private, in a digital space. Section 11, calculations. We consider the scenario of an attacker trying to generate an alternate chain faster than the honest chain. Even if this was accomplished, it does not throw the system open to arbitrary changes, such as creating value out of thin air or taking money that never belonged to the attacker. Nodes are not going to accept an invalid transaction as payment, and honest nodes will never accept a block containing them. An attacker can only try to change one of his own transactions to take back the money he recently spent. The race between the honest chain and the attacker chain can be characterized as a binomial random walk. The success event is the honest chain being extended by one block, increasing its lead by +1. And the failure event is the attacker's chain being extended by one block, reducing the gap by -1. The probability of an attacker catching up from a given deficit is analogous to a gambler's ruin problem. Suppose a gambler with unlimited credit starts at a deficit and plays potentially an infinite number of trials to try to reach break even. We can calculate the probability he ever reaches break even, or that an attacker ever catches up with the honest chain as follows. And there's some math equations there for you. So this section starts to get into some mathematical proofs and concepts to explain what we talked about earlier in section 4 of the white paper in regard to proof of work and what it would take for an attacker to compromise the network or the blockchain. Now, Satoshi, in my opinion, brilliantly equates this scenario to another famous math problem known as Gambler's Ruin, and shows us the math for how to calculate and demonstrate the scenario on our own, which you are more than welcome to try on your own. But if you're not super comfortable with doing this kind of math, suffice it to say that the gambler has an extremely low, a near negligible chance of breaking even after starting their gambling spree from a deficit, especially as that deficit gap increases. So likewise, an attacker has those same odds when trying to rewrite the blockchain and catch up to the honest chain from their deficit. The deficit now being the 15 years of energy spent and growing. Given our assumption that P is greater than Q, the probability drops exponentially as the number of blocks the attacker has to catch up with increases. With the odds against him, if he doesn't make a lucky lunge forward early on, his chances become vanishingly small as he falls further behind. We now consider how long the recipient of a new transaction needs to wait before being sufficiently certain the sender can't change the transaction. We assume the sender is an attacker who wants to make the recipient believe he paid him for a while, then switched it to pay back himself after some time has passed. The receiver will be alerted when that happens, but the sender hopes it will be too late. The receiver generates a new key pair and gives the public key to the sender shortly before the signing. This prevents the sender from preparing a chain of blocks ahead of time by working on it continuously until he is lucky enough to get far enough ahead, then executing the transaction at that moment. Once the transaction is sent, the dishonest sender starts working in secret on a parallel chain containing an alternate version of his transaction. The recipient waits until the transaction has been added to a block, and Z blocks have been linked after it. He doesn't know the exact amount of progress the attacker has made, but assuming the honest blocks took the average expected time per block, the attacker's potential progress will be a Poisson distribution with expected value as follows. And here is, again, some more math. To get the probability the attacker could still catch up now, we multiply the Poisson density for each amount of progress he could have made by the probability he could catch up from that point. And there is some more math, rearranging to avoid summing the infinite tail of the distribution, and then that being converted into C code. Now again, not super important that you can completely decipher this math or this code, but suffice it to say that if we go to the if you run that code, which expresses that math as a simulation, we can see as the deficit increases at a linear rate, which is Z or Z, which is the block difference. So Z equals 0 with a 0 deficit or 0 block deficit. We can see the probability is pretty much 1. Well, it is 1, or pretty much guaranteed that you will break even. But as we go increase at that linear rate, the probability of breaking even decreases at an exponential rate. So by the time we get to block 10 or block 50, we are looking at some pretty abysmal odds. Section 12, conclusion. Home stretch, guys, we're almost done here. We have proposed a system for electronic transactions without relying on trust. We started with the usual framework of coins made from digital signatures, which provides strong control of ownership, but is incomplete without a way to prevent double spending. To solve this, we proposed a peer-to-peer network using proof of work to record a public history of transactions that quickly becomes computationally impractical for an attacker to change if honest nodes control a majority of the CPU power. The network is robust in its unstructured simplicity. Nodes work all at once with little coordination. They do not need to be identified since messages are not routed to any particular place and only need to be delivered on a best effort basis. Nodes can leave and rejoin the network at will, accepting the proof of work as proof of what happened while they were gone. They vote with their CPU power, expressing their acceptance of valid blocks by working on extending them and rejecting invalid blocks by refusing to work on them. Any needed rules and incentives can be enforced with this consensus mechanism. And these are the references on the last page, page 9, that Satoshi Nakamoto cited at the end of the paper. I actually cited some of these same sources during my brief history of internet money video. If you want to learn more about some of the fascinating iterations like B-Money and Hashcash, feel free to check that out. All right, so that concludes the white paper read-along. We got through it at a pretty decent rate here. I think we're coming up on just under an hour. But hopefully following along with me helped you understand Bitcoin and some of the technical concepts associated with it on a deeper level. The white paper can be a lot, even though it's only 9 pages, it can be quite a lot to digest for those who aren't super familiar with a lot of the concepts. So again, hopefully this helped you digest some of those concepts and get a clearer fundamental understanding of what Bitcoin is, what the intention was, and if you're interested in learning more, hopefully this created a lot of questions that came to mind. For answers to those questions, check out my channel. I will be answering popular questions in videos, and if you have any outstanding questions, go ahead and just drop them in a comment on any of my videos, and I will be happy to answer them. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening.